All right. All right. Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're going to be talking about William Fleming, so one of our two local patriots. Arguably, the bigger name is his friend Andrew Lewis. And so we're going to be sort of exploring the other side of Fleming tonight instead. Now, this is our first time ever doing it for a Thursday night talk. Even if you've come to one of our Living History Days and heard it, though, I have some new research in here tonight that you have not heard before. So we're glad you're here. A couple disclaimers I want to give before we get started. So for one thing, as often as I can, we're going to be talking a lot about Native Americans. This is the early colonial period. There are still Native Americans living all throughout Virginia. As often as I can, I am going to be using the specific tribal name. If I'm talking about general things that are happening with multiple tribes all throughout the state or even throughout all the colonies, then I'll be using the term Native American as an inclusive term, but as often as I can, I'll do the specific tribes. So don't let me catch you off guard. Don't let me lose you. That's why I always give that disclaimer. The other thing, too, is we don't know what William Fleming looks like. So however you choose to depict him in your head tonight, sure, that works. We do have this stand-in silhouette that we generally use for him, but we actually don't have any depictions made during his lifetime of him. So with that, before we really get into him here in the colony, we got to start across the water, off in Scotland. So he's born somewhere in 1728-29. You are also going to find a lot of times where I'm going to have to give approximate dates, but 1728-29, he is born in likely Jedburgh, but somewhere in that region of Scotland. Now, he is educated early on and always has this fascination with science and especially with medicine. And so all of his early education is really sending him towards going into medicine. And so his other interest very early on is also travel, and we'll see that play in a little bit as well. So once he gets to his early schooling, he does, as was typical at the time, it enters into an apprenticeship. So from the ages 16 to 18, he was an apprentice of an apothecary. And so he is in a couple different places. The main thing is main episode that really shapes the rest of his life is in Kendal, Scotland. So during this is the time of the Jacobite uprising. So in 1745, Scotsmen were rallying behind Charles, Edward, Louis Philippe, Casimir Stuart. Doesn't have enough names, but he was the young pretender, the Bonnie Prince Charlie. Modern audiences, we tend to know the name Bonnie Prince Charlie, but basically claiming that he had the rightful claim to the throne. And so there's a conflict that moves through Kendal, and even though people were trying to stay out of it, these troops are moving through regardless. And so this is our first instance of him treating soldiers. An outbreak of measles goes through the camp of the rebellions. And so a case of measles goes through and they're treating them for that. Also, a little bit later, there's a conflict again. They're trying to stay neutral in Kendal, but basically a Jacobite general is in town the same time as some of the British soldiers, and so a fight breaks out there. It's on a market day. It's just there in the middle of town, and so this is the first time that Fleming is having to deal with soldiers' wounds. So not just sick soldiers, but actually dealing with gunshots, stab wounds, everything else, and so. From here, we start to see him having a lot to do with military and becoming more of a military surgeon. So after that, he is stationed, or he leaves the station of his apprenticeship and goes to the University of Edinburgh. We don't know for how long because the University of Edinburgh had a fire in the late 1700s, and so they lost all the records from this time period. So this is a depiction of what the medical school at the time would have looked like. All that we know for sure is that he was there in 1746 and took one class in anatomy, and that's all we know about this time period. We can assume he probably took more, but we don't know because, again, they've lost the records. Now, we're also entering into a time that is completely undocumented for Fleming himself. Now, the family legend is that he served in the British Navy, and at the time, Britain and Spain were at war. And so he was captured. He was on a ship, British naval ship that was captured and then taken prisoner. At the time, it was very common for prisoners of Spain and Portugal to be kept off the coast of either Africa or South America, especially South America. And so the family legend is that he was kept there. He apparently only survived. He credits surviving, as he told this family, this legend to his kids. He only survived because there was a woman who her property was right next to this prison where they were being held, and took pity on the soldiers and brought them over food and would throw food over the wall to try to keep them alive. So he says that's the only reason he didn't starve. Now, we don't have any official documentation for this, but again, it was a tale he told his children and then was passed down through the line, through the Fleming family. But regardless, so in 1750, there was peace between, so Portugal and Spain were at war, and then England was caught in the middle. There's peace between them, peace with England. And we see that this is the first time that he makes an appearance in Virginia. So it does kind of line up timeline-wise. Now, the first record of Fleming in Virginia comes in 1750, and he is marked down being in a parish providing medical services in Nansemond County, which is today part of the city of Suffolk. This image here is actually some of his medical tools. These are probably tools he used a little bit later in his life. But again, he is a surgeon. He is there. He is treating sick and sort of being the medical professional for a lot of people throughout the Commonwealth. And so these tools are actually on display right now at the Taubman Museum. So you can go see them in downtown Roanoke, and they belong to the Historical Society of Western Virginia, also in downtown Roanoke. So we thank them for loaning them to the Taubman, and we thank Taubman for displaying them. And we also have a piece on loan in this exhibit that his tools are in as well. So you can go check that out. It's up through the end of January. But again, our very first reference to him is him basically, he would have been hired by a parish, and then anytime they had people come in who were sick, he would have been the one to tend to them. And so he was one of the main medical people for them. And then that brings us up to 1754, when the French and Indian War breaks out. Now, at the Salem Museum, we work with a lot of school groups. One of the main things that we have to dispel is, no, this is not a war of all the French and all of the Indians or Native Americans versus the British. It is the French and their native allies versus the British and their native allies. And so Britain and France are at war. And the rest of the world, they call this the 7 Years' War because it actually was closer to a global conflict than not. But it breaks out in 1754. And again, Fleming is immediately a military doctor. So we see that early from his early education, and then it is coming in use here. Now, one of his first stations is in Williamsburg, so the capital of Virginia at the time. Less where they're seeing fighting, more where he is helping to recruit people. Now, this gives credence to that family legend that he was part of the British Navy, because they're only going to ask people to recruit if they have some sort of experience. If you don't have military experience, you're one of those people being recruited. So the fact that they're asking him to help out with that does say he had some form of military experience prior to 1755. Now, he's stationed there, he's helping with recruiting troops, and as well as tending to, if they do have severely wounded people in the region, then they're going to be transported into Williamsburg, and he's going to tend to them. In October, he is transferred to Fort, I think I'm saying this right, Fort Dinwiddie. This is in present-day Bath County near the Warm Springs. So if you know where Warm Springs are, this is a fort near there. And he is underneath a man named Captain Hogg. And he is with this company for many months. They're actually doing a lot of expeditions further inland, where it was so undiscovered country to Englishmen. Obviously, Native Americans were well acquainted with it, but it's believed that they got as far as modern-day Wytheville from there. So they would go out on camping expeditions. If they had any kind of skirmish, anything like that, they wanted to make sure they had a medic on site with them. And so that was why Fleming is going with them. And again, one of his big things is that he wanted to travel. And so he's starting to get that part of one of his youthful ambitions. Now, in 1757, he is formally made part of the 1st Virginia Regiment, where he is serving underneath George Washington, and he meets one of Washington's friends, Andrew Lewis. and they form a lifelong friendship. And basically from here, if you're familiar with some of Lewis's stories, you were going to be hearing some of them because Fleming was there for quite a lot of them from 1757 on until Lewis's death in 1781. They've become very, very good friends, and you'll see that reoccurring throughout, including they are both at Fort Duquesne. Now, if you can't tell by the fact that I pronounced it Duquesne and it's spelled like that, it's French. It is one of the main French forts that exists at this point in time. And so it's where modern day Pittsburgh is. It's Fort Duquesne at this point. Eventually, it also becomes Fort Dunmore. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Then it becomes Fort Pitt. The area around it was Pittsboro, Pittsburgh. So modern day Pittsburgh. What ends up happening at Fort Duquesne is it is supposed to simply be a scouting expedition. They're underneath a Major James Grant, and they are sent to go up and see how many troops do you think there are in the fort? Can we take them? They have about 600 to 800 British troops with them, including Fleming and Lewis and George Washington. And they think that there's about 200 soldiers in the fort between the French and native allies that are up there, especially the Shawnee. They think it's about 200 in there. They have 600 to 800. And so Major Grant, who by all of these soldiers' accounts, who all kept diaries and wrote letters and all that kind of stuff at this time, they all write at this point, when they get this report back from the scouts, it's the middle of the night, and Major Grant has been drinking all night. So he is drunk. And he's like, we can take it. So he orders the striking of the drums and does what at the time was a very common military maneuver. This is very like textbook European being taught over on the continent, they called it at the time, where what you do is you send your musicians out front. That'll send a little expedition, a scouting expedition out to investigate what the sound is, and then you attack. And then your armies would have a fight. Like I said, they have 600 to 800 soldiers with them. The doors to the fort open up. They actually have 1,200 plus soldiers within the fort. So they don't even stop at the musicians. They go straight into the first line of defense, which is Lewis and Fleming in the 1st Virginia, go past them and are immediately on Grant and the rest of the backup men as well. So terrible fight, incredibly hard battle. In fact, at one point, Fleming is standing there. He's kind of downhill a little bit, and he looks uphill, and he sees Andrew Lewis get into a fist fight with a Shawnee warrior. They both go down. Lewis comes back up victorious, and immediately the Frenchman puts a pistol to the back of his head. So suddenly this friend that he's made over the last year and a half or so, they think he's dead. They think him and Washington both believe that Lewis is killed in this fight. In fact, Washington writes back to Andrew Lewis's wife and says as much. But ultimately he was not. He was simply captured and moved among forts until the Battle of Quebec a few years later. But that 1758, Fleming does not get captured or anything like that. He has a lot of wounded to tend to that night, as it was a major loss for the British. And so he's tending to them that night. He, again, continues to serve with the 1st Virginia and was still under Washington. Eventually, Washington leaves the 1st Virginia, and William Byrd, another local Patriot name, William Byrd takes over and leads the 1st Virginia, and Fleming is serving underneath him. In 1760 is when Lewis is freed from the Battle of Quebec. Him and Fleming are united, but there's not too much fighting that happens after that. That's sort of the end of French and Indian War, at least in the United States. Continues in Europe, but we don't worry about that. Now, after this, like I said, they become very good friends. Lewis, whenever he first immigrates to Virginia, immediately lands in Stanton. That is where Andrew Lewis and his father and all of his family live. And at this point, he's also married. This is where Fleming decides to move to as well. In fact, if you go to downtown Stanton, just off of Beverly Street, there is a marker dedicated to William Fleming because he was the local surgeon there. And so it was the Augusta County Courthouse is right near where this road marker is. And so Stanton is actually founded in 1761. That is the same year that Fleming moves there. And arguably one of the most important things for his personal life that happens during this time is that this is where he meets Anne, who went by Nancy Christian. And so she was the daughter of a colonel, Israel Christian, and brother of William Christian. So if you know Christiansburg, just over the mountain in New River Valley, that's her brother. So William Christian, Christiansburg, and then over here in Roanoke Valley, spoiler alert, is where Nancy ends up living with William. And so the two of them are wed in April of 1763, very likely to be in Israel Christian's home there in Stanton. And in fact, in the museum, if you come and visit us, you can actually see Nancy's sampler. So we have that on display upstairs on third floor. So she made that item. We also have, as you saw in our promotion poster for this talk, we have one of William Fleming's swords that he received during his military time. So you can see both of those on display. And so they were married and would live the rest of their lives together. Another thing happens in 1763 is that Fleming writes to the royal governor and says, we need a sheriff for Augusta County. We need a county lieutenant, essentially functions as a sheriff, who is going to keep order. That's going to be the person who calls on the militia. Every man between the age of 16 and 60 has to serve in the local militia to defend their homes. If there's any kind of skirmish with Native Americans, prior to French and Indian War, you'd have skirmishes with the French as well. That if there was some sort of issue, the governor would call on Augusta County, send 20% of your men or send X number of men, and then would have to go off and serve. So he writes a letter to the governor saying, we need one in Augusta County, and it should be my friend Andrew Lewis. So the governor agrees. He knew Lewis from prior military experience. And so because of this, Fleming kind of becomes Lewis's second in command. Now, they're not always popular because of this either. Another big episode in Augusta County history and Lewis history is the Augusta Boys. So in May of 1765, there were a group of Cherokee men. So this is just above some Cherokee territory down below, although it may have been some Eastern Siouan speakers as well, but records aren't exactly clear from the time period on the British side. And so there's a group of Cherokee men who are traveling through Augusta County, and they do what's very common at the time. If you don't get quite to a tavern or something that night, you'd stay in a barn, just to have some sort of shelter, and then you would get up very early the next morning and leave something, either a little bit of money, some food rations, just something for the farmer as a thank you for letting us stay the night here. Well, unfortunately, these men are discovered by a group of white men and are murdered. Now, why were they traveling through Augusta County? The night before that, they'd been staying with one of their friends, Andrew Lewis. So these were Lewis's personal friends and likely knew Fleming very well as well because of their connection that were staying in Augusta County. And so the next morning, Fleming is actually the first one who's on the scene. And then Andrew Lewis comes up right behind that. That morning, they captured two of the murderers. That afternoon, they captured two more. The next day, they captured another. Now, why is this so important for Fleming's story as well? Is because this group of men decide to call themselves the Augusta Boys, and they write an open letter calling for, at best, the removal of Andrew Lewis from office, and at worst, the bodily harm of him and William Fleming, because Fleming helped with the rest of these men. Now, nothing really comes of it because Lewis stands his ground. Fleming is his right-hand man right behind him. They stand their ground and say, no, Lewis says, as long as I am in office, these men are going to see justice. Unfortunately, they kind of just get a slap on the wrist from the governor once they go to trial and are let go. But for Lewis and Fleming's part, they do their best to make sure these men are not able to just get away with it until it comes from that higher power. Now, around 1768, this story comes local as he establishes his Belmont estate in what is today Roanoke City. And so him and Nancy move out here. At the time that they move, they have one child named Leonard Israel. So again, named after his grandfather. Unfortunately, he does not survive childhood. Ultimately, Nancy and William would have a dozen kids together, 6 boys and 6 girls, but only half a dozen of them would survive till adulthood. And so their names were Anne, Eliza, short for Elizabeth, Dorothy, Priscilla, William, and John. And so I'll come back to William John in a little bit. So that's 1768. In 1771, his friend Andrew Lewis also comes down and joins him in what is today Salem, making his house where the Civic Center is today. I'll talk about where Belmont is today at the end of this. And in 1771, Lewis comes down and joins his friend William Fleming. Yay! Lord Dunmore also becomes the royal governor of Virginia. Boo. So what that means is, so this is what it looks like around the time that Dunmore comes down here. At first, he is the royal governor of New York, and he doesn't necessarily want to come down. But there's one very enticing reason to come and be the governor of Virginia instead of the governor of New York. Virginia is the oldest colony. Virginia is the wealthiest colony. The other thing, too, if you look at this map on your screen, you can see that above New York is white, because that is where there is water. There is not a lot of room for expansion. Versus Virginia. Virginia at the time includes what is today West Virginia and Kentucky, and there's all of this land along the Ohio border as well. So lots and lots of room to be able to offer out land. Because as the governor, the way it works is you are getting money every time anyone pays taxes. So the more people that live in your Commonwealth or colony, the more taxes that you're going to have, the more money you get to pocket, the wealthier you are. And so Dunmore does end up taking pride in becoming a Virginian to a certain extent until he doesn't during the Revolution. But what ends up happening is, once again, Fleming is the right-hand man of Andrew Lewis, but Lord Dunmore's war begins in 1774. So this begins as men are encroaching into the Ohio River Valley. The Shawnee and Mingo warriors, or Shawnee and Mingo peoples that lived there, start sending their warriors out to attack settlers in Virginia. So much so they're no longer just staying there where settlers are encroaching onto their territory, borders that were determined during the French and Indian War, that entire war that we fought for a decade before. But they're also just coming into Virginia and attacking people. And so it was not great enough, but they were only doing that because they were encroaching on their side. So you can see how it's on both ends. So what ends up happening is Dunmore declares war on that final band of Shawnee and Mingo warriors. And but he says it's going to be different. To the Virginians, he says, no, think about those the old stories, how the kings lead their men into battle. That's what I'm going to do with you. And so he does a whole speaking campaign to try to muster the men, but they really don't have any significant movement until that September. So what ends up happening in September is everybody gathers in Williamsburg, all the militias gather in Williamsburg. Dunmore and half of the militia from the northern half of the state, they go up to Fort Dunmore or Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh today. And then Andrew Lewis is leading all the men from the southern part of the Commonwealth. And William Fleming is, of course, one of his right-hand men with that, as usual. So they get up to what was original the rendezvous point, which is Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And in October of that year, the Battle of Point Pleasant takes place. Now, I mentioned how Dunmore and his men go up to Fort Pitt. Everyone at first was supposed to go to Point Pleasant. But Dunmore decides to change course halfway through to go up to Fort Pitt, and then it's like, there's some undiscovered country up here in Ohio. We can go and explore that while we go and try to find the leader of the Shawnees so we can try to broker a peace. And so he sends a letter down the river to Lewis and Fleming and their men who were stationed at Point Pleasant, and they were still waiting on other people. They were still waiting on William Christian and Thomas Ingalls, if you know Ingalls Farm out in Radford. Those two were coming behind with a lot of the supply for the army. They hadn't arrived yet, and so Lewis was like, no, we're sticking with the original plan. What they didn't know is when that messenger came down the river, if you look on this map here up at the top, you can see where it says, apologize for the language, but you can see it says Indian Camp. So that was where that band of Shawnee and Mingo warriors were. And so they realized that this messenger is coming down and telling all of these soldiers to move north. So what they do is overnight, the October 9th to 10th, so that the morning of the 10th. They cross over the river and they lay in wait on the road, thinking that the army is going to pack up, move. They're not going to be expecting anybody, and so they're going to have a surprise attack on them. Well, because of Lewis's stubbornness and wanting to wait for Ingalls and Christian and the other men, that's not what happens. Instead, two men get up the next morning to go hunting to get some food for the men, and they discover this band of warriors on the road. One of the men is killed instantly. The other one is just able to get back to camp and sound the alarm before he also passes from his wounds. So Lewis and all the men are immediately having to scramble. Lewis is the head of Botetourt County at this point. He had founded Botetourt County in 1770, and his brother Charles was over Augusta County, where they'd grown up in Stanton. And so what ends up happening is Lewis has Charles Lewis and Fleming form two lines. And so they are traveling, they're going up the road here to meet the band of warriors. So Fleming led a battalion of soldiers from Botetourt, Fincastle, and Bedford, and then Charles led the men from Augusta. And it is a significantly harder fight than what they expected. I mean, obviously, they only have half of the army, so it is going to be a harder fight no matter what. And so what ends up happening is Charles is one of the first wounded. In fact, the men are still marching up to the battle whenever he is mortally wounded, realize that he took a shot to the chest, realize that he's probably not surviving it. But instead of worrying his men, he just turns around and says, I'm going back to camp. And as he's passing men, he shouts, fight on, go get him kind of messages. Fleming is therefore left at the front, and he receives one of the worst brunts of the attack. He is shot 3 different times, keeps fighting after the first 2 shots. So he is shot. The first one, it depends on the account that you read. Some of them say that it was in his the lower part of his left arm. Some say it was his leg. Another is the second shot hits his side. You can mute yourself for a second if you don't want to hear a kind of gross part. In fact, it actually takes off a chunk of his side, and multiple soldiers write about his lung protruding out. All right, I'm going to wave, so if you muted, you can come back. And then the last shot that finally takes him out is he is shot in the shoulder and loses the use of his left arm for that night. That wound would actually stay with him. That ball would stay in his shoulder for his remaining 21 years of life. And it is said that night at camp. Now remember, he's the surgeon. He's the medic. Their best medic is now down for the count. And so multiple soldiers have accounts of him that night. He was on his one good arm and his one good leg, crawling between cots and helping the men as best he could, tending to them. Again, the name of this talk, I always put surgeon first because that was Fleming. He wanted to help people. His draw was to medicine from the youngest days. And so you can see that even though this is his last day of his military career, he's 2 wounded after that. We're going to talk about how his health just keeps deteriorating. But this is the last day of his military career. And even though half of his body's down for the count, he is using the other half that he can to help as many of the men as he can. I think that really speaks to who Fleming was as a person. Now, Battle of Point Pleasant has 2 legacies. One is the legacy that it's had since about the 1800s, and then the other one I'm going to posit a little bit more to you. So the first legacy is that this is the last time that Shawnee and frankly Native American warriors are attacking this far east into Virginia. That's not necessarily true, as we know that there were Native Americans attacks as far as the New River and Roanoke valleys, because Fleming and Lewis and Colonel Preston, who's the Smithfield plantation out in Blacksburg, all write about it. So, but that's the legacy of the battle in the 1800s. Far more important, though, is that all of these men, so they lose Charles Lewis, who is absolutely loved in Augusta County. William Fleming is this hurt. They lose over 20-some men, and they're like, this wasn't supposed to be this hard of a fight. If we'd had the full Virginia army with us, if we hadn't only had half of it, then we wouldn't have had this bad of a fight. And so a lot of the men begin to question, where was Dunmore? And again, this is 1774. We're post-Boston Tea Party. Boston is occupied. There are lots of places where people are saying, hey, if all the soldiers being in Boston can happen up there, it can happen down here in Virginia. And so you start to see all of these ideas come together as we get into the Revolution. Unfortunately for William Fleming, we got to kind of divert from that a little bit. He's a very important statesman during the Revolution and has a very important role in Virginia history during the Revolution, but that is the end of his military career because of how wounded he is at Point Pleasant. Now, he does regain use of his left arm to an extent, but he's not fit to serve and hold a musket and everything after that. And so really what his legacy after that is he becomes a leader. He is very important in the establishment of first Kentucky County, which is just the entire state of Kentucky. And so he's traveling around Kentucky, checking on forts that are out there, checking on men that are out there. This picture that I have here is a depiction of a battle that took place in Kentucky around 1778, if I remember correctly. So again, he can't find himself, but he's helping establish forts, directing men where to go, what to do, helping with militia musters. As he's traveling around, he also has the surgical tools with him and is ministering to the sick and wounded as much as he can as well. And in Kentucky, there's a lot of issues where patriots are having to fight a lot of Tories or loyalists and Native Americans who are British allies as well out there. So that's what a lot of the skirmishes that he's having to deal with are. Now, he's also a senator to the Virginia General Assembly that's established. And so he represents Botetourt, Montgomery, and Kentucky counties. So the entire state of Kentucky, and then Botetourt and Montgomery County were much bigger than what we think of today. And so he attended the General Assembly throughout the war. And in fact, in 1779 to 80, he is commissioned by the Commonwealth to go out through Kentucky and really just do a lot of documentation. Documents what forts are out there, documents how many people are living out there, what the fauna is like, just a very general, broad survey of Kentucky. But I think one of the most important things with this is while he's identifying where to build forts, they also give him a certain acreage of land in Kentucky where he can build his own house. So he can build wherever he wants. He has an entire state to choose from. Wherever he wants to build a house for him and Nancy and their kids, he can build. And he spends an entire year out there. And he comes back and writes, I could not find anywhere as beautiful as my home in Virginia. That is how much he loved the Roanoke Valley and how much he loved Belmont and being here in the Roanoke Valley specifically. And he never moves. So when you're reading some of the history, I was actually encountered this today. As you're reading documents, it talks about how he had land out in Kentucky. But if you actually dig into it, he never did anything with that land. He was simply promised it, but he didn't use it because he loved his home here in Roanoke. So he stuck with that instead. Now, in 1781, so the last year of the war, in June, he becomes the third governor of Virginia. Now, is it only for a few days? Yes. Are we going to hold it against him? No. From June 4th to 19th, he was the governor of Virginia after Thomas Jefferson resigns. He is actually the next in line within the government, and so he steps up in as governor, and he is one of the main things that he is signing into, or not necessarily signing into law, but having executive orders on, is declaring troops where to go for the war. And so since he is signing laws and especially helping command troops during this very important year in the war, he is deemed the third governor of Virginia. And so, unfortunately, he could have stayed, but due to his health issues, he did not seek re-election. He'd already decided not to seek re-election even before Jefferson resigned, and so he stepped up to become the governor for those couple of weeks. And so, thanks to his acting with official authority, we get to claim him as the third governor. Now, after the war ends in July of that year, in 1781, he once again returns back to Belmont. Now, I talked about Belmont before whenever it was brand new and they just moved in. By this time, it has become a much larger operation. So again, he is a surgeon. So he is able to afford a lot of things, but he is still, part of that is all of this land that he has, and he does have enslaved persons that are working it as well. So in his letters, he referenced that he was raising cattle, sheep, hogs, and horses, and then he was growing winter grain, corn, oats, peaches, tobacco, tomatoes, and more. He would just write, etc. We don't quite know what else he had beyond those things. As far as the people who were working on these fields and working within the house, we know that he contracted a servant named Mary Williams who lived in the house and served him and Nancy. And then he had other enslaved persons who worked on the farm and likely in the house as well. So in 1779, he purchased a boy named Patrick and a girl named Sarah. And then at his passing, he had a list of enslaved persons, and their names were Millie, Cyrus, Duke, Tommy, Jack, Alexander, Harry, Fanny, James, Sal, and her child, Polly. So again, all of those animals, all of those crops that I mentioned, they're helping with cultivate all of those. But as a surgeon, just like today, back then, your medical professionals, they're always going to have more money. And so he was also putting in large orders. We know he was sending orders out to stores in Richmond, as well as being mentioned in some of our Southwest Virginia places as well, including the store in New Bern, which is today the Wilderness Road Regional Museum. And then I believe he also was mentioned in a store out in Wytheville as well, or somewhere in that area. And so he's making orders, and so they still have these ledgers that mention him and all these household goods that he is purchasing. Now, beyond this, the other thing that he's doing from Belmont, as much as he can, at least at first, is he is traveling and serving as many of the sick and wounded as he can. So he's performing surgery, he's helping out anybody throughout the Roanoke Valley, maybe even traveling more into the New River Valley and further southwest as well. We know that in 1781, he is by Andrew Lewis's side when Lewis passes away. So Lewis was still very important in Botetourt County. So he was traveling for some county business when he gets sick on the road, and he stops off at a house in Bedford area, and they call for his surgeon. So his friend, William Fleming, and then two of his sons are able to make it as well. So Andrew Lewis has two of his sons and his good friend, William Fleming, by his side whenever he passes away. And so after that, again, we know Fleming is still traveling, tending to the sick. But by the time you get to 1782-83, he actually loses, so he's losing the use of his left arm because of those gun wounds and because of a different illness that he contracts. By the end of 1783, he can't use his right arm either. So both of his arms are gone, and actually at one point he also loses the use of his legs. So something important for horseback at that time for traveling. And so by the time you get to 1784, he is mostly working from home, to use the modern term. He is retired to Belmont. He is still writing letters as best he can, likely dictating them to Nancy or someone else, and then getting them sent off. He's very instrumental in the establishment of getting Kentucky recognized as a state. So if you or anyone you know lives in or has lived in Kentucky, you can thank William Fleming for it, because he is the one who really advocated that this is such a large swath of land. A lot of people are living out there. They deserve to have their own representation and have their own statehood. And so he's doing a lot of that work during this time. He does leave his house. He leaves Belmont one last time in 1788. He attends the Constitutional Convention. He represented Botetourt County at the Constitutional Convention where Virginia ratified the Constitution. He recognized the importance of it, and so he made one last trip, likely in a carriage, as he couldn't have gone on horseback himself at that point. But he does make the trip up to Richmond to argue on behalf of the Constitution. Again, having served in French and Indian War and in the Revolution and all of this, he is still serving and recognizes this importance. And so he ends up passing away in 1795, but his one last time that he left was for that Constitutional Convention. So 1795, he passes away. And today, where his house was, is the old Monterey Golf Course in Roanoke City. So you can actually visit. Him and Nancy are buried together at Old Monterey, and there is a cabin that still stands. That's the legend is that it was there at the time of Fleming and his wife, but not entirely sure on that. So, as a good historian, I'll say that's what the legend is. But you can go visit him, and you can look at some of what was his Belmont estates and plantation and everything that there was out there. And so even though Lewis is one of our more commonly uttered names, we do have the William Fleming High School in Roanoke City as well. And you can see how much he really did have an impact on Virginia history, Kentucky history, and really just making sure that he represented as many of the people that he was tending to as a surgeon as he could. So I think with that, let's go ahead and stop the recording.